Welcome to the Paul Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Welcome to episode 6 of season 2 of the Paul Street Journal. Today, we're going to be talking about documents from Pope Paul VI, who we spoke about briefly already because our previous episode was on a document from Vatican II, which Pope Paul VI closed. So the documents from today are Populorum Progressio, which is written in 1967, and it's an encyclical, and also Octogesima Adveniens, which is not an encyclical, but touches on this economic question that we've been following throughout the podcast. And it's written to a cardinal that's very relevant to the question and on a pontifical commission that's relevant to this question of economics and society. So before we jump into the documents themselves, Brian, let's talk a little bit more about Pope Paul VI. I think we've already talked about him a little, but it'll help to refresh and then maybe talk about the landscape he's in for these documents. So Brian, please take us away.
Sure. So Pope Paul VI is now a saint, somewhat recently.
Yeah.
He was born in 1897 in the province of Lombardy, which is, I'm sure you remember if you were watching season 1, the Lombards were German barbarians who carved out their own little slice of Italy. And even though they were in charge, they didn't make up the majority of the people, but they ended up blending in, and it ended up becoming a part of Italy. And this is where both Pope John the 23rd comes from, as well as Pope Paul VI, both saints. He had 2 brothers. His father was a lawyer, politician, and also an active member in this thing called Catholic Action. Catholic Action was a movement back then all over the world that really focused on enacting Catholic social teaching on economics and other things. So his father was really well-connected, articulate, and fully into this Catholic social teaching thing. His mother was a descendant of rural Italian nobility. Okay. So he decides to become a priest. He gets a doctorate in canon law. Fast forward a whole bunch of years, he becomes the Archbishop of Milan, just like Pope Pius XI was.
Right.
So he's following in the footsteps of his predecessors in many ways, and he's totally on board with his predecessors in regards to economics as well, theology in general. So he becomes the Archbishop of Milan, and he immediately gets involved with economics, which reminds you of who? Leo. Right? Yeah. Leo was put in charge of a province, immediately gets involved with the economy, working on trade, labor. Then Pope Leo was given a larger territory, and we see the same thing with Paul VI here. He really prioritized evangelization and did so in some rather innovative ways. So he built over 100 churches and chapels in key locations throughout Milan to encourage prayer in the middle of the day, on Sundays, things like that. He also began a movement of preaching in places that are not religious at all, such as factories, libraries, hospitals, offices, things like that. So bringing the gospel to people outside of the church. Interesting guy. We know he's going to eventually write Evangelii Nuntiandi and it really focus his papacy on evangelization. So we see that happening early on in his life.
Yeah, I think it helps to remember that he closed Vatican II, right? And that was a lot about, we read Gaudium et Spes, which was the church in the modern world. So It's not surprising to hear him encouraging preaching in, modern, non-religious places.
For sure, yeah. So he becomes Pope. He becomes the first Pope to leave Italy while being the Pope in a very, very long time. First Pope on an airplane. He goes to 6 different continents. He is seen, and many believe that he was elected Pope because you can't put him in a box from a political perspective. Is he a leftist? Is he a right wing? Nobody was able to really identify that. He seems to be a middle of the road type of character, which is, I think, what the church was looking for at that time. But being in the middle of the road in an era of political polarization is not fun.
No.
And liberals dislike you for being maybe too right for them. The right-wingers don't like you because you're a little too left for them. Mm-hmm. And people who are very moderate in polarized eras oftentimes come across to people on the polls as polarizing. It's very unfair, but this is how it works.
Yeah, you see that today.
Yes. Too, right? Yeah. I one day I might write a book called Extreme Moderation. And it's a joke, the title, because moderation is the opposite of extreme, but you're often labeled as such.
Yeah.
So how did he make so many people unhappy? Well, to a leftist in the 20th century, everybody was waiting for the church to finally give in on unnatural contraception. Everybody was thinking that the Second Vatican Council was going to finally be that moment where, just like the rest of the mainline Protestant churches in the United States, the Catholic Church was finally going to follow suit and allow contraception. And then Pope Paul VI releases Humanae Vitae saying no. So, of course,
got a lot of people
the people on the left are very upset. And Pope Paul VI continues the trajectory of Catholic social teaching in regards to economics, which infuriates people in North America and in the West. These are polarized cultures that desire hard right, hard left policies, and they don't get it. Mm-hmm. So we see that he's walking this middle road in many ways and disappointing a lot of people along the way.
I hear you, yeah. Yeah. I think that comes through in the document too, that like real moderation and the reality of polarization, and Pope Paul writing in the midst of it, and trying to say this is, the appropriate way for us to go. And I think it comes out really clearly in the documents. What's the landscape?
By the time of Pope Paul VI, we are in a new philosophical era, which we last episode called Postmodernism. So modernism says something along the lines of, if we're not going to subscribe to like religion and Christianity, we have to subscribe to something. And that thing is going to be technology and power, right? And that's what we get in Soviet Russia. That's what we get in fascism, right? It's power wins. So World War II ends with 100 million deaths, the introduction of nuclear weapons, and it turns out that modernism didn't work. And power and technology isn't always our friend, right? Sometimes it could lead to destruction, not just innovation and progress. So postmodernism was a rejection of modernism, and it was this belief that, okay, you have your truth, I have my truth, and we're just going to agree to disagree. And of course, that's self-contradictory, because truths that contradict each other can't both be true.
Right.
But that's just what postmodernism is. So there is no truth except mine. I'm just going to pursue pleasure, avoid pain. We get the sexual revolution, where people strip off a moral code and just become hedonists, essentially.
Hey everyone, it's me. Sorry for interrupting the show. I'm sure I probably interrupted Brian talking, so it's okay. But I just want to jump in to say that if you're liking the Paul Street Journal and you want to see more content like it, please do like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so that you're notified when we have any new releases. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comment section, and we'll try our very best to respond to them later on in the episodes. Also, make sure to check out the other shows that are produced by the diocese. Those shows are Beyond the Beacon with Bishop Kevin Sweeney, which you can find on Bishop Kevin Sweeney's YouTube channel, and Coffee with Cupkey with Father Paul Manning and Monsignor Raymond Cupkey, which you can find right here on the St. Paul Inside the Walls YouTube channel. With all that said, thank you. Let's get back to the show. It sounds to my ear like Pope Paul VI is writing in a chaotic time, like a globally chaotic time, given some moral problems, some militaristic problems, political problems. And I think the document from my reading, becomes a little bit more global than the previous popes. Like it's on the ground global, if that makes any sense. Like he's talking about the issues that are happening around the world and how we are to respond. You said that Gaudium et Spes was the first and only document to be addressed to the whole world, right?
Council document, yeah.
Right, council document to be addressed to the whole world. And it sounds like this is Pope Paul VI writes kind of in continuation of that, like he's still responding to the whole world. And the document specifically, which we're going to go into first, is an encyclical titled Populorum Progressio, which is on the development or progress of people. And like I said, I think he's writing from a very global perspective. It's not now just, I'm writing to the church. This is what, the human person is. It's just, okay, now you are all children of God. This is how human development should be considered or seen, I think is kind of why he's writing this. But how do we jump in? Where's the starting point for us?
To me, it's a circle, and you have to just jump in somewhere. So
nice. Encyclical, right? You said
encyclical means circle. That's true. So I'd like to just start by saying that you could summarize the document from an economics perspective by saying that the economy of the world should serve mankind and not just a few. And it's the Pope's perception, because this Pope, he went to 6 continents, first Pope in a long time or ever to go to Africa, but he spent time in Asia, Philippines. He witnesses firsthand the disparity between the wealthy nations and the not so wealthy nations, and really doesn't think that from a global perspective, the economy of the 1960s is working for most people. Now, if you live in Western Europe or the United States, and if you haven't traveled, you probably think that the economy is awesome, right? But that's not the case in many other parts of the world. St. Augustine has this famous quote, "The world is a book, and those who don't travel read only a page," right? And that's the case no matter where you are. If you're in a certain place, the world is a terrible place. If you're in another place, the world is a wonderful place, and there's great disparity. So this document is going to make the argument that private property is very important, but it's a secondary principle, and it serves the universal destination of goods. So private property should not be getting in the way of the goods of the earth getting to as many people as possible. Private property should serve as a means in which the goods of the earth are given to many people.
Right. Yeah. I think the popes before Pope Paul VI sounded like they were kind of getting, we mentioned the development of this question from being just capital and labor to then evolving, and then involving nations. And then now I think Pope Paul is really focusing on that, like the whole world. This question applied to the whole world. And that comes with developments to doctrine, right? Like there was an emphasis on private property before because the question was a bit smaller scale. It made sense to focus on it, and now I think he's reiterating, affirming private property, but really reminding that it must not get in the way of what those popes would have said is the primary principle, that it should serve man, and man including everyone altogether, right? And I think he's really just bringing that more to light now that it's applied at a bigger scale.
You're right on. The big focus on private property in Rerum Novarum was, for Leo, he was contradicting Marx and Engels and the communist understanding of things. So that was Leo's idea, is private property is part of the solution to the problem, and he was saying that in the face of Marx and Engels.
Right.
So what private property could become, it could become something that if very few people own it, it could be getting in the way of justice as well. So that's what we're seeing here,
right?
A little bit.
So for me, reading this document, a lot of it felt like a summary on the question overall, like what is the development of the person? What should that look like? So for a lot of the document, I was like, oh, this is him kind of like generalizing and summarizing what has been said. It felt a little like Gaudium et Spes to me. We had a small section from there, and it was kind of just reiterating all the things. And this is how this feels to me slightly. So I'm curious to know how you think the developments come through. What is new, or what is Pope Paul VI getting at that perhaps isn't just a summary from before?
Yeah, I like that question a lot. If you have read, if you're in the listening or viewing audience and you've read all of the documents that we've been talking about so far, from Rerum Novarum to Gaudium et Spes, and then if you were to read Populorum Progressio, you may think that there is not much new at all in here, and it's just a summary. There's some truth to that. But the context in which this document is written is also really important. And understanding the context, I think, is critical for understanding what's being said. So let me give an example of the World Fund that Pope Paul VI is calling for. The World Bank, with the International Monetary Fund, they were trying to give large sums of money from wealthy nations to poorer nations to help, which is very good. But it was a neo-colonial kind of arrangement that they were establishing. So they would tell Catholic countries, we'll give you all this money to help with economic development as long as you give unnatural contraception to your nation. So basically, these nations were put in a hard place, a lot of them Catholic. Do you want the money or do you want to follow your religion? You had to choose.
What came out to me a lot was this duty or big responsibility he's putting on, the powerful and the rich. This World Fund has a huge responsibility, if done correctly, to these poor nations. The rich person has a responsibility toward the poor.
Yes.
In addressing this question, there's some people that, because they have more resources or power, they have bigger stake in the game and they kind of have a bigger duty. And I think that's what's coming through with the World Fund idea. He talks specifically about like taxes for the wealthy versus the poor nations versus poor nations.
And you can see how this is infuriating people. But we got to be careful with how we're hearing that too. So he talks about taxing the wealthy more than the poor, but that doesn't necessarily mean a progressive tax system. You know what I'm hearing when I hear that? I'm reminded of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. When they were trying to raise money to fund a federal government for the first time following the American Revolution, they both experimented with the whiskey tax, which is like a luxury tax. Like, do you need whiskey to survive? Some would say yes, but the answer is no. And that was an attempt to raise money on something that was more of a treat for people, a luxury. And it didn't work out because there was no national currency and whiskey was actually the currency out west in like Pittsburgh, which is hilarious. But so it didn't work out. But from the very foundations of the United States, this idea of taxing the wealthy, not with a progressive tax system necessarily, but with a luxury tax. If you're buying a $120,000 car, you could probably afford a higher tax with that, right? So that's probably a little bit more just and equitable than the progressive tax, in my opinion.
And I think Pope Paul VI is, I think what I'm trying to highlight and when he highlights is more so that idea that there is perhaps more responsibility in the hands of those who have the power to help. He doesn't, and none of the popes ever suggest exactly what system or mechanism should be used. He just suggests general ideas like, okay, what kind of tax can help? We should find out what that is.
Yeah.
I think there's an article of this document where he talks about 3 major duties, and I think that they're helpful, perhaps, because I think that they're what he kind of emphasizes throughout the document. But the 3 major duties he talks about are mutual solidarity, and he says the aid that richer nations must give to developing nations. He talks about social justice, the rectification of trade relations between strong and weak nations. And then he also talks about universal charity, the effort to build a more humane world community where all can give and receive, and where the progress of some is not bought at the expense of others. So I think that's like Pope Leo, just laying out duties, not necessarily saying these are the mechanisms, but saying this is what we ought to do. And some people are more responsible than others. There are some things that will work better than others, but I think it's just another call to action, essentially, which we've seen in the popes before too. So yeah, it's paragraph 44, which I think does a rather good job of explaining the document, I think. Is there anything else that comes through in Populorum Progressio?
Just one other thing that I wanted to mention. He talks about reform versus revolution. And this is something that we've been talking about since season 1 in regards to, we differentiated between the two in regards to the Protestant Reformation. Like this idea of authentic reform versus revolution, which is more of a violent, against first principles, against foundational principles kind of movement. So he's saying violence for economic change is just not acceptable. If you want reform, good, reform, but do so in a nonviolent way. Oftentimes when somebody disrupts a marketplace or does something very innovative in a good way, they say, oh, he's a revolutionary. That's really not an appropriate word. So I think he's taking part in the semantic debate here.
Yeah. I think that you're right. I think that he's calling for reform, not revolution.
Yeah.
But sometimes it feels very, what's the word? It kind of shakes you up. Even reform will shake you up because it's new. You're moving forward. I think in summary of Populorum Progressio, the thing that came through the most is this global question. And specifically, I think the universal destination of goods being kind of paramount, and how the economy is meant to serve man. There's just this real appeal to Catholics, to non-Catholics, to those in power. Specifically, I think those in power, whether that's wealth or political power with nations, to do things appropriately, like not neo-colonialism, not seeking my own benefit by helping someone else, right? I think that's the general call and development in Populorum Progressio. And I think that the next document that we're going to read, Octogesima Adveniens, feels a little like practical advice, at least when I read it. It was like it's a development of Populorum Progressio, and I think it's a way of implementing it. It's at least I think that's what it felt like to me. Octogesima Adveniens is written in 1971, which is 4 years after Populorum Progressio, but it is not an encyclical. It is an apostolic letter. So the weight is a little different, right? Because we talked about the doctrinalness, I don't know if that's a word, of encyclicals. But he's addressing the same question, and he's addressing it to Cardinal Maurice Roy, who is head of the Council of the Laity and head of the Pontifical Commission of Justice and Peace.
And he's Canadian.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but
it's good.
Just kidding.
It's good.
So it's to someone in a position to address these questions, right? I think what comes through from Pope Paul VI a lot of the time for me is this action. It's like we can't just start talking about the principles. We must do. So he's now writing an apostolic letter to someone who's in a position where doing can be done, right? So Octogesima Adveniens. Any words as an intro for it?
The only intro thing I'd like to add to what you said is that the Octo is 80, which means that it was written 80 years after Rerum Novarum. So we get the Quadra, we get a number of others, and then we're all the way to 80 years, the 80-year anniversary of Rerum Novarum.
Right. Yeah, and this one I think is released on the anniversary date specifically.
Is it May 15th?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. So yeah, again, it's explicitly a continuation of that, right? So just because it's not an encyclical doesn't mean it doesn't fit into the line. He's kind of saying it does. It's a little different, but okay, so let's jump into the document itself. Where do we start? It's also kind of a circle.
Yeah, it's a circle. I don't know where to start, so I'm just going to start listing some things.
Okay.
And we'll do so briefly to keep it exciting. So he says that no form of injustice or discrimination could be based on race, your origin, whether you're male or female, your culture, your religion, that economies should exist that don't discriminate against any of those things.
Right.
And this is at a time when it is happening. So even in the United States, it's well known now in hindsight that banks were giving better interest rates to certain zip codes and worse interest rates to other zip codes. It wasn't well known at the time, but it's well known now. So we get this idea of like even systematic racism,
right,
in the banking system of the United States in this era. Another thing is we get the beginnings, the first inklings of the principle of sustainability for the environment. So he starts saying that we need to keep the environment intact for future generations. It really wasn't mentioned that much beforehand. And we know that Pope Francis is going to really expand on that with Laudato Si. And that seems to be maybe a liberal thing, but you have to keep in mind that this is the same Pope that released Humanae Vitae and was against contraception. So one seems leftist, one seems right-winged. Both come from the same origin, which is this participation with nature.
Right.
It's actually classical conservatism.
Right. Yeah. I think I love the language he uses in the document. I think he like calls back to Genesis and says how man was supposed to have dominion over the earth. But I think he kind of suggests that with technological development and technological development becoming this kind of idol, that now the earth has, in a sense, the environment now has dominion over man. Like or maybe not that extreme, but man no longer has the dominion that he's supposed to have over his environment. The environment is a difficult place to be in for man. And I think that that's kind of, what, like you said, Pope Francis starts to develop. You read the quote last episode about man is not supposed to be flooded with like metal and whatnot, and asphalt and all the things. And I think Pope Paul VI kind of, in a way, emphasizes that too.
Yeah. I like the way you're saying that. And, I think about Genesis. Genesis tends to promote this idea of agreement over competition with nature. And you have a balance in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So God says, fill the earth and subdue it, almost like, like conquer nature. So in that sense, nature is an enemy. And indeed, sometimes it is. If you encounter a lion in nature and you try to pet it, it's going to eat you, So there is a competitive element with nature that we all have to be real and recognize. But at the same time, Genesis says Adam is given the mission to cultivate the garden, to keep it, to protect it. And keep meaning like the role of like a goalkeeper, like to protect.
Yeah, like a guardian.
A guardian, right? So are we guardians or competitors with nature? Well, it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And here, in the era of nuclear energy, we have to think of ourselves for sure as a keeper of nature. Another big thing here is he's saying to avoid political ideologies. So he's saying, try not to belong to the isms, whether that's political, whether it's economic. He's saying in paragraph 36, he says, go beyond every system. Christianity is above that stuff. Don't subscribe in an unhealthy way to these things. And he's not saying like, don't vote for anybody. He's not saying that, but he's saying, don't be one of those political or economic ideologues that finds their way, especially on the polls.
Yeah, I agree. There's a big call to retreat from it. I think he highlights how dangerous they can be for the human person. They can kind of consume the human person. And there's a never-ending desire to keep progressing, I think, from an ideological point of view. He has a bit about, for the Christian, progress is a good thing, but it always has this connection to the scatological death, right? I think some ideologies are economic ideologies specifically, like are constantly trying to figure out, constantly trying to develop, constantly trying to progress. But then Pope Paul VI reminds us that for the Christian, there's death. There's this thing after all this progress and indefinite progress that we're trying to make. And it's like a mysterious thing because he's not like, stop making progress. But he is saying that our progress does meet death inevitably, right? I don't know. It was a cool image. It made me kind of like reflect a little.
This goes back to the very origins of the church. St. Paul would say, I keep my eyes on the prize. That's eternal life. So everything in Catholic social teaching and in economics and in politics is important, but it's certainly secondary to the eschatological.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I love the way that he highlighted it. I thought it was so powerful, I guess. I think there's this perspective from Pope Paul VI that although we're retreating from ideologies and the systems and the isms, for the Christian, for the Catholic, there's not a uniform expression. He kind of starts to emphasize that life is going to look kind of different for different Catholics in different places, of different backgrounds and ideas, and that is okay and in some sense good. And I think that kind of gets to the end of the practical call he starts to make. But any thoughts on that? Where Pope Paul VI starts to kind of venture into the okay form of pluralism, that there's a plurality of options of expression of faith.
Well, first of all, Pope Paul VI would not believe in multiple truths, right? There's one overarching truth. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. There are many sub-truths that follow that one original truth. So he would not believe in a doctrinal or a dogmatic pluralism, but he would agree with this concept of there being many different looking types of Catholics who all are in line with Catholic doctrine. So there's so many examples and so many planes in which I could give an example. I'll just give one just to demonstrate. But as a result of Catholic social teaching, we see major reforms in factories, in industry, and we get an urban type of Catholic. Simultaneously, we get a rural kind of Catholic lifestyle evolving, which would follow the trends that we mentioned with John the 23rd and like a Catholic agricultural kind of movement and system. So those two types of lifestyles are so different, and they seem in one way like just entirely different lifestyles to the point where they could see each other as rivals. And what Pope Paul VI is saying here is that no, even though that type of Catholic looks entirely different than this type, they're both in solidarity with one another. They're both fulfilling the gospel, just in very different ways. So he's saying that in the 20th century economy, there are so many different styles that are acceptable and appropriate. He says, don't judge the other types, and don't fall into what I call the heresy of stylism. That is, to look down upon a certain type of Catholic that's in union with the church from a doctrinal perspective, but not doing things in the style that you prefer. The same could be said of liturgy, of location, who knows, right? Profession. There's just so many types of good Catholic. He says, don't discriminate.
Right. So I think what I like a lot from Pope Paul VI is the idea that while it is those who are exploiting power and their riches, or exploiting others using their power, considering their own self before others, well, that is perhaps a concrete problem. He kind of points at the main problem is the lack of fraternity, the lack of universal brotherhood, I think. I think that's like the crux of the problem. And the other things are symptoms. Like the lack of love, I think is essentially what he calls the main issue. And then I think, and I think that can extend even to Christians. Like you said, there's different expressions, there's different perhaps sub-truths, but like the same universal truth that everyone's adhering to. And I think he's fair to note that at first it might seem like those Christians are in opposition and kind of like start to point fingers. Like there's like this animosity that gets built if other Christians aren't using my style of Christianity. But I think that there's this real call from Pope Paul VI for those people to kind of seek to examine one's behavior and in a real way recognize that, like deep down, the things that unite us are so much stronger than those things that are different about us, right? And I think that call is essentially what the call to action from this document is, that we are to examine ourselves and to do what we can do and to recognize that he who has a different style or expression than ours is still seeking the same thing, still seeking the kingdom of God, still seeking brotherly economic love. And I think paragraph 48 is where his explicit call to action, I think, is. And it's practical. Like, I think a lot of the times I mention how some of this stuff can feel like, what am I supposed to do? Like, this is great, but how am I supposed to change the law? How is any of this going to be attained? Right? And his call to action kind of really brings it down to each individual. And he says, let each one examine himself to see what he has done up to now and what he ought to do. It is not enough to recall principles, state intentions, point to crying injustice, and utter prophetic denunciations. These words will lack real weight unless they are accompanied for each individual by a livelier awareness of personal responsibility and by effective action. And I think that that's a wonderful call to action. If it's like a perfect puzzle piece with the unity, not uniformity. Like, as long as we're all united with the same goal, with our different expressions of faith, different styles that we express, different skills, even different weaknesses, with the grace of God, you know, if each one of us examines where we are, what gifts we have, what we're passionate about, that's the call, right? And I think that's been the call since the beginning of the Paul Street Journal, for our own heart to be lit on fire for love of Jesus, love of his kingdom, and to seek to do it. But we also, I think Pope Paul VI is very practical. He wants to reel it in. And one thing it makes me think about, which I mentioned to you before, is this circle of influence and control, this examination of, maybe Joe can put it on the screen. I don't know who developed this. Joe will give credit because I don't want to plagiarize. But there's this idea that for the human person, there's this circle of concern. And in it are all those things which concern us. And outside of that circle are the things that don't concern us, like the weather in Mississippi. It doesn't really concern me very much. But the weather in Madison, New Jersey, I'm quite concerned about. But then in that circle of concern, there's some things that we can influence and cannot influence. So the weather in Madison, New Jersey concerns me, but I can't influence it very much. So the real place to examine ourselves, I think this call to action that Pope Paul VI is calling for, is that circle of influence. Like, what concerns me and what can I influence? What can I do about it? And that's what he's asking us to examine. Sit there, reflect, pray about it, see what's my passion, my desire, what I'm concerned about, and what gifts and ability and power I have to live it out.
And that's in line with the principle of subsidiarity. And what you're going to end up finding yourself doing is watching less news, like national news, because you have very little control over that, very little influence over that, and you're probably going to be working more local.
Yeah.
Because you do have influence in your family, you do have influence in your neighborhood, in your town, much more than at an international level.
Right. Yeah, and I think it kind of points to the idea that, like, if we spend too much effort in those things that do concern us, but we can't control, we're looking past and neglecting some of the things that we should be concerned about and should be exerting our power over, right?
Yeah. And you're also going to be emotionally stable.
Yeah.
Because if you are focusing all of your attention on international issues all the time, and you have very little influence on it, it'll drive you crazy.
Yeah. No, it would.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's good to be aware of it. You need to know enough to vote, but if you're looking at that kind of stuff every day, something's wrong.
Yeah. I think it's just like reevaluating and practically addressing those things, because you know those things that do concern us at an international scale, we should be concerned about, and our influence can be practiced through voting or through other mechanisms. But we have to really examine what lies in each circle, right?
That's right.
And I think it's whoever you are that came up with that, God bless you. I think it's wonderful. Stephen Covey. Thanks, Joe. But yeah, it's a wonderful thing, and I think it fits perfectly with Pope Paul VI's call to action in this apostolic letter, Octogesima Adveniens. And I think that does it for the documents from Pope Paul VI. I think they were great. There still more to come.
Sadly, we're not going to be addressing anything from Pope John Paul I. So we're going to be moving on to Pope John Paul II next.
Awesome. He was around for, sadly, very short time as Pope. So We'll get to John Paul II next, and I'm excited. I think a lot of people probably are. But that does it for today. Thank you, Pope Paul VI. Thank you, Joe, for production. Thanks, Brian. And thank you all for listening to the Paul Street Journal. See you next time.